Hello everyone and welcome to another session of AP Human Geography with Mr. Elrod. Today we're going to continue on in Unit 6, Industrial and Economic Development. In our last couple of videos, we were looking at the Human Development Index and discussing what this idea of development meant and how we might quantify these ideas of development using the United States, not the United States, but the United Nations model on development. And again, remember there are a lot of different indices that the United Nations use to look at development. Those specific factors that they look at, those four that we discussed to create their Human Development Index. And so today what we're going to look at is what's called the development gap. And so as you can imagine, we talked a little bit about the purpose of the development index was to try and identify those countries in the world that were more developed and less developed, and talk about discovering the areas that some countries are doing really well and other countries are not, and then how do we improve the position of some of those countries by looking at things that people are doing well, and then maybe trying those out in those other countries. So through that we begin to look at the gap that exists between the most developed and the least developed countries, and so that's what people have started to call the development gap. And so, of course, so maybe let me be a little bit more clear and simple here. The development gap basically is just the gap that exists between the levels of development between the more developed countries and the less developed countries. And what people have been pointing out and noticing is that the more developed countries are developing faster, or they're growing faster, or they are improving faster, and than the less developed countries. And so what happens as a result of this is the gap widens. Now, this doesn't mean that less developed countries are not developing. In fact, they are developing, and Hans Rosling would argue that they're developing quite well, and the world seems to be doing pretty well. But people who maybe don't share his views on everything feel like the less developed countries are not developing fast enough, and so because the more developed countries are developing at a faster rate, then the gap continues to widen, and this is what is called the development gap. Now, when we talk about the development gap, there are two not necessarily charts, but ways that we can display this idea. Two ways we can display this idea spatially. There's one that's based on this kind of regional split, and it's what's called the North-South Gap. So basically, the North-South Gap looks at the northern hemisphere versus the southern hemisphere, with a couple of exceptions, and the line's not exactly straight, but that's okay. And basically the idea is that the northern hemisphere is higher levels of development. The southern hemisphere has lower levels of development. I like this particular graphic here because it shows you you got the population pyramids here, you got some indicators here, you got employment structures, and then also the urban versus the rural populations. And so I think that's kind of an interesting graphic to look at. So again, when we display it this way, this is called the North-South Gap. It's based on this red line here that's roughly 30 degrees parallel. That's called the Brandt line. Another way that we can graphically display the development gap is through the CorePeriphery model. And we discussed the CorePeriphery model, we talked about it in our political unit, but it is more kind of a geographic model. And remember, it's based on this idea of it works with this idea of the world system analysis, talking about the economic relationship that exists between the core, the semi-periphery, and the periphery. And remember, I guess if I was better prepared, I should have a North Polar projection map on my screen to show you this idea of the countries that are in the core, the semi-periphery, and the periphery. In fact, that might be something good for you to do right now. Maybe pause the video. Go Google not a CorePeriphery, but a North Polar projection to try and understand this idea of the spatial distribution within the core, semi-periphery, and periphery. So again, those are just two ways that we can graphically or spatially show the development gap: the North-South Gap, the Brandt line, and then the CorePeriphery model using this idea of the world system analysis. Now, when we talk about the reasons for the development gap and the reasons for the relationship or the economic relationship that exists between the more developed countries and less developed countries, there are two main groups that emerge as far as their attempts to explain it. We have what are called the structuralist, and there are those that we call the liberals. And so when we look at these two sets of ideas, the first one we're going to look at are called the structuralist. Okay, so the structuralists, basically what they say is that the global economic structure is set up to favor more developed countries over less developed countries. And so the structuralists are the ones who are proponents of the dependency theory. If you'll remember the dependency theory we discussed back in our political unit also as a holdover of the imperialist era. Even though the less developed countries, the former colonies, are free, the idea there is that they're still dependent on the more developed countries for the capital that they need in order to improve their country, in order to maintain their infrastructure, in order to trade, those types of things are still dependent on them. So there's that idea of the dependency theory. So the structuralists, again, let me rephrase this. The structuralists believe that this global economy was created by the more developed countries, and therefore it is stacked in favor of the more developed countries. And so the more developed countries need to keep and want to keep the less developed countries poor in order for them to maintain their dominance within the global economic structure. And again, they use the dependency theory to explain this whole concept, this whole idea. If you remember when we talked about the dependency theory, and I'm not going to go through in detail because I went through that in the political unit. And so if you want to, you can go back and look at that video. Basically, you look at that idea of Wallerstein's world system analysis and the relationship between the core, the periphery, and the semi-periphery, and how that idea where the core gets raw materials from the periphery countries. They get cheap labor and finished products from the semi-periphery, and so in order to maintain their standard that they have, then the core countries need the periphery and the semi-periphery countries to kind of stay in the position that they're in. And so we're talking about this whole idea of dominance of the core countries over the periphery and the semi-periphery countries. And again, the idea there is you look at the colonization of Africa, the imperialism of Africa, as well as other parts of the world, and after colonialism was over, many of those countries are in similar situations. They're still dependent on the more developed countries for their capital. They're still dependent on those countries in terms of needing the core countries to purchase the goods that they are producing. And so it's still that the more developed countries, the Western countries, the United States, still kind of have a hold on the global economic structure, and so therefore they are the ones who are going to dictate the terms, and they are therefore going to use that ability to dictate the terms to keep less developed countries down. Well, that's all that we're going to have time for today. The next time when we come back, we're going to look at the liberal idea of the development gap and economic development. It was just called Rostow's model. So I hope you found that to be helpful. If you have any questions, please leave those in the comment box below, and I hope to see you next time.